energy is changing. And you can see from the official data, what I'm referring here are all official data. In 2011, the electricity was 26.9%, and in 2 years later was 28.2%. And we have had a lot of renewable electricity in Portugal. We can see the power installed. I hope there is no colorblind people in the audience. You are colorblind, so the big ones, the big bar, the blue ones, the higher in the beginning are hydropower. And the others growing faster, which are green, almost reaching the large ones, are wind power. And all the other smaller ones are biomass, small hydro, and solar. And solar very little. And this is the evolution in Portugal. And this is the way the electrical consumption, which is by the black line, is the only line, the evolution is more or less stabilized in the last 7, 8 years. And we can see on the top one, the renewables, they have been growing, plus the second box, which are the hydro. And we have been growing every year. Last year, what was equal to 2013, the hydro was a major source. Second was the wind. And third, coal. The fourth one, the cogeneration, other renewables, and the import balance. Only the natural gas was the lowest of the sources. This year, this year, the data up to May, wind is the largest one, followed by coal and by hydro. And this has been a constant. And in 2014, we have had 63% of renewables, which is an important thing. And this year, we are not as good, but 57.9, because it has been a dry year. But as you can see from here, the largest source is renewable. And here is together coal, the 28.9, the gray, is together coal and natural gas. Or another aspect to showing the evolution in the last 3 years. You can see there is a lot of variability, for instance, of the large hydro, with a stable variation in the wind throughout the last 3 years. And the renewable is more or less stable, so we have consolidated to have this thing. And this is important. Renewables is important, not only a question of because it's nice, because it's fashion. No, there's other impacts, like, for instance, in the economy. And we have done a study with Deloitte, and this study is not a theoretical, it's based on information collected in 90% of the companies operating in the sector, that the contribution of renewable electricity in 2013 was 2.7 billion euros, and in 2020 will be 4.3 billion euros. And if we do exportation of 10% of the electricity, this figure will be more or less double in 2020 that was in 2030. We create jobs, and this is the jobs created until 2013, 40,727. The lower figure, the 2,811, is direct jobs, and the 37,916 is indirect jobs. And we can grow from 40 to 66,900 or to 88 with the export scenario. And there's a lot of contribution on renewables by the sector. And you can see, like, by each megawatt installed, the bioenergy brings 2.5 jobs, creates 2.5 jobs. The hydro, 3.3. The wind, 4.6. And the solar, 12.1. And also, the average contribution of the worker in the renewable sector is almost twice of the normal worker. The normal worker in Portugal contributes with 36.3k euros per year, and the worker in the renewable sector with 62.4. And also, it's important that we contribute for the independence. If we didn't have renewable electricity, our dependence was on the top of this board. And the lower line is with the contribution of the renewables. And you see some oscillation. They are due because the dependence is higher when we have a dry year. We have to produce more from thermal sources. When it's a wet year, we produce less, and it's lower. And our prediction done in 2013 for 2014 was 71.4. Yesterday came out the official figure of 71.1. This means that we have reduced significantly in 13 percentage points the dependence from abroad from energy. And from these 13 points, 10 points are due to renewable electricity, which is very, very important. And also, we have achieved another thing. In 1999, in each megawatt hour of electricity, or let's put to be more close to our scale in home, for each kilowatt hour that we spend in our homes was carrying 640 grams of CO2. In 15 years, we lowered this figure to 220 grams. We divided by 3. And what is expected that we divided again by 2.5 on the next 15 years. And this is important. However, people are it's very common to hear that renewables are expensive. And using the official figures, in the way the official entities do the calculations, they say that in the period 2010-13, the additional cost of renewables were 3,025 million euros. And the benefits it brought to the economy in these same 4 years, the savings were 5,756 million euros. 5,371 in savings in import of gas and coal, and the 385 million euros in the not buying CO2 license. So this is quite an important. So this is not, we are good, renewable electricity is good, and also brings in the economy a certain number of benefits. And I believe that in the role of renewable electricity in Portugal, we should be proud from what we have done, because we have a mix of wind, water, sun, geothermal, very good. Our companies and technicians are very good in managing these things. It's important that we consider that is an example. I can say that very often in Portugal, the electricity we consume is 100% renewable. Even wind is sometimes over 90% of the total consumption, which is not an easy thing to achieve. So I believe that we should be proud of what we are doing, and this solution we found here in Portugal is a winner. And this will be more winner as long as the time goes by, because the cost of electricity from renewables is always going down with the time, not going up as certain other types of electricity. And that's why I think we should bet on this renewable horse. Thank you very much.
Now we have a space open for time open for questions, because our guest has to go. So please, if you have questions, raise your hand. No? No, everything. Yeah, please. Sorry.
Antonio is just to hear his opinion or his feedback on a certain inconsistency between the slide where you show the actual money savings that the renewables are providing and a lot of the news that we hear in the media about the costs of this transition that you showed so clearly from 1999 on, where we have greatly increased the renewable penetration, obviously at a cost. But then when you show a balance, a yearly balance, you show a very good image, which I don't necessarily think is not true. I hope it's true. But we hear a lot of news that are completely different from that, and perhaps it's interesting for you to comment.
It's not an easy question when we have short time. See if I could have a blackboard and do some drawings. But usually there are people that want to present just partial vision of what's going on. And as you must know, also same thing in your field, like the press propagates better a lie than something is true. Because a lie is very easy to understand and make sense. Usually people say, okay, renewables are expensive because they are new, so they must be expensive, period. And keep on going like that. And it's not. Of course, when there is a change in technology, there is an additional cost initially. Otherwise, we cannot introduce a new technology. You must remember, for instance, when we introduced the mobile phone system, the first ones were very, very expensive. Because the price only start to coming down later on. And that's what's happening. And people, usually the people that are commenting, making this type of comment, still thinks 10, 15 years ago. And for instance, we know that solar, the prices in the last 10 years are now 10% than was 10 years ago. And today I was saying to Carlos at lunchtime that the new wind farms, they are starting to operate now. They are receiving 74 euros per megawatt hour, and they have to pay 2.5 euros from that, a kind of a tax only wind pays, 2.5% to the municipalities. And currently in Portugal, to produce only the natural gas necessary to produce 1 megawatt hour costs 80 euros. And on top of that, you have to pay the investment, the loans, the operational maintenance, and profit. And so there is a margin. We are low now, and it will be low. And this will be displacing the traditional sources that are more expensive. And we are going on that way. I believe that we have had this discussion with our Minister of Environment and Energy, Jorge Moreira da Silva, and he says that sometimes I'm not ambitious enough for the future, because he would like to have 100% renewable electricity by 2030. And I say, with the evolution of the technology, this will be impossible by what we know now, because, you know, doing forecasts is very difficult, especially when respect to the future. When respect to the past is easier. But I said to him that 80% is a quite interesting target, and probably in 2040, in the beginning of the decade of 2040, we'll be able to have 100% renewable electricity. And this, because the technology is there, the capacity is there. There is a lot of things done in the TI technology of information, and also in the power, in the way the power is controlled. The computers has entered the power system, and we can manage a lot of things. There will be storage. There will be also the prosumer. That means that we can become partially producers of our electricity. Everything is changing, and there is no way the prices of electricity from renewables are going up. They are always going down, better quality and safer, and that's the way we are. Thank God to the sun, the light he sends us to her. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you, Antonio. I enjoyed your presentation. I'd like to ask you a question. I think not everybody has realized that the way in the old times we used to produce electrical energy was big plants, be it hydro, be it coal, be it oil. Okay. And that implied a distribution system and an interlinked system of one kind. Nowadays, with wind and solar, the paradigm has changed, because you have many places with smaller, it's a relative thing, size. So you have a whole lot of control and interlinking so that you can make use of what is available. My question is not how much does it cost to produce the kilowatt hour, but how much does it cost to put the kilowatt hour at the consumer, which is a different thing, because you have the distribution on top.
No, the network. Okay, I believe the additional costs are negative costs. This means there are reduction on costs. Why I'm saying that? Because in the past we have, I have to stand. We have the country with a few power plants, and we have the interconnection from that power plants. And now we have a dispersed system that we have smaller power plants distributed through all out of the country. So this means there are less losses in transferring. So probably you can, if you look, the closest power plant from Lisbon is in Carregado, and in the past was in Castelo do Bode. They are big power plants. However, if we go to the outskirts of Lisbon, just north of Lisbon, there is a lot of wind farms. So they are closer. So this means that the electricity have to come, not all the electricity has to come from the other power plants, because the major power plants that are used in the past in Portugal were hydro, which are north, usually north of Mondego. Maybe there are some here in Castelo do Bode and so on, in Zézere, and the coal power plants, which were one in Sines, the other in Abrantes. And now we have closer. So this means less losses. Of course, we have more costs in managing the system, but nowadays is a necessity, because the kind of viability we have now in the system, and with the computer tools that have been developed, the thing has been done. So I will say, on the overall, maybe the costs are lower, maybe the losses are lower, but it's a different system, as you mentioned. It's a completely different system. I think that the electrical system is going throughout something that we all have seen. Is concerning, I think the electrical system has to suffer what I call an internetization. The word doesn't exist, but I like to make words. And what I mean by internetization, as you remember, in the past, when the internet started, we could do only some downloads, and very small ones. And after they start to increase, and after one point we could do some downloads and uploads. And sometimes we also have to have, and nowadays we have storage of information in the clouds and so on. Of course, we are not be able to have storage of electricity in clouds. We have to have a physical support of it and near to us. But we are not nowadays not only consumers of electricity, but we are also producers. And maybe in the near future we also can store some information. So that's why I say we are suffering internet. And you can say, okay, but what are the costs of internet not comparing? There's a lot of gains. And we are suffering also the same gains, not because electricity is not like internet. Electricity needs a physical grid behind it. It's not floats. The electricity doesn't flow throughout the space. And this will have a cost all the time. But we are going in a cheaper and cheaper way, little by little.
Who is going to be Guilherme Carrilho da Graça.
in engineering from the University of Lisbon. He's going to talk about sustainable architecture.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. So this panel, I was sitting there and thinking about the connections between the three presentations. Perhaps the order is not evident, but there is a clear connection, of course, where Sada Costa discussed how the sun can bring us more renewable electricity. I will talk about how we can make more efficient lighting for buildings and its impact on sustainable architecture. And then we will hear about the technology and the evolving technology of solar photovoltaics, which of course is the most promising renewable technology that is sort of evolving at the moment, as Sada Costa mentioned. I think it's also important to speak to you a minute about my experience with Professor Mariano Gago, who passed away recently, as we all know. He was my teacher at the university, and I was just thinking about how my experience with him changed the way I interact with many of my students, because Mariano Gago was the most informal professor that I had in its interest in what we had to say and what we thought about things. And in particular, one episode, I was in one of his classes and I got up from the back, what I thought was a discreet exit from the classroom, and he stopped me and said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Well, I need to finish a report, a physics report, I'm sorry." And his response was for me a bit changing, because he said, "Of course, go ahead, do it. And that moment, that level of interaction, of very intelligent interaction that he was able to create with his students, shaped a bit the way that I like to interact with my students. So in addition to all the other legacies that we know from him, this is my the small change that he imparted in my relation with the students. So 15 minutes to talk about light in sustainable architecture. It's quite difficult, at least for me, because it's a very broad subject. So the way my presentation will feel is a bit jumping up and down, or sometimes leaps and bounds, because we have to move through quite a lot of material. Of course, my expectations are to be able to give you some ideas, some examples. And so hopefully in the end you will be more confused than you are now, because that builds up knowledge, I think. That's what I say. So, of course, it starts in the sun. We have a resource that is magnificent and drives most of what happens in our planet. And what we have with our eyes, for whatever reason we may want to consider, either through evolution, from a Darwin perspective, or from a God perspective, we have our eyes are optimized for the peak of solar radiation. So solar radiation has a peak in a wavelength, and I'm sorry, I don't know what happened here. So there is a peak in the sun, in the solar radiation in the visible part of the spectrum that is coincident with the peak in the sensitivity of our eyesight. This peak in sensitivity of the way we see, of course, is very important, because we tend to create, or have the goal of creating in buildings conditions that are better than outside, or at least not worse, or better in some aspects and worse in other aspects. For instance, the auditorium where we are is better than if we were outside the pavilion, because outside the pavilion we have too much light to see the slides, and they are cutting trees with chainsaws. We couldn't hear anything. Maybe a tree would fall on us and so on. So in the auditorium, we're better. We are in a better environment. But this containment that the auditorium creates also brings problems. Containment of pollutants, odors, heat, and so on. And we end up using energy to create the conditions we want. And so we have energy consumption because of the building. And this is very important. Buildings have an impact that is quite significant in the overall energy consumption. In particular, in this chart, is the one I found for today. We are in a global society, so this is the USA. I don't think there's not significant differences. So in terms of primary energy, buildings represent about 40%, which is quite a lot. The other two components are transportation and industry, that are around 30 each. Of course, when we look at what Sada Costa mentioned, when we saw all these great figures of renewable electricity in Portugal, which is great, that will impact a lot on our 40% of the buildings. But of course, transportation is still petrol-based, right? And it's still 30%. So we need a lot more renewables, in fact, if we want to reach a higher number of true impact on the whole energy consumption, not just buildings, okay? Now, in buildings, in commercial buildings, you see that lighting, so artificial lighting, where in fact, for instance, now we are using artificial light, and outside we have a lot of light. So again, is a situation where the building creates conditions that induce an energy consumption that we could think we could avoid. In fact, it would be very, very close to impossible going away from this for us to have this session. So outside, as I said, it's very hard. But anyway, so lighting is 20%. And then, of course, whenever we have lights, and if the lights are from a technology that uses a lot of energy to produce the visible radiation, that is light, we have an induced space cooling and ventilation consumption because we need to remove the heat that the lights bring into the building, okay? So lights in commercial buildings may go up to 25% of the energy consumption. So just to say, when we think about sustainable architecture and we are talking about light, we are talking in commercial buildings about 25%, okay? Now, the first thing we can say is, okay, let's bring in some windows to bring in the light, and then we don't have some of this consumption. So if we open, if we have a window providing daylight, we could eliminate 20% of lighting consumption. But of course, we would not eliminate the space cooling and ventilation. We can even increase, that's the problem, okay? So the problem we have is that the architecture and engineering design community generally delivers natural daylight solutions that increase the building energy consumption, except with some exceptions that I'll show. Normally, when you have a window, you have increased consumption. It's very sad, in fact. Maybe, of course, we all like windows, right? So maybe we need that increased consumption, but there are extreme examples. Of course, buildings will be interacting with the sun. And when we look at the different facades in a model building, okay, so from southeast, southwest, northwest, northeast, throughout the day, these are 3 days, they're all pretty much the same. What we see is that the north and east orientations have heat gains, watt per square meter here, during the morning, and then the west side has heat gains in the afternoon. So the worst case scenario for us are western orientations, where the building has already warmed up throughout the day and more heat is coming in through these orientations. So how is light used in architecture? So of course we have 2 worlds in architecture. We have the artificial light and the natural light. Normally, of course, we need both, because every day there is a night, and then we need the artificial light. Even if the daylighting system is fantastic, we still have this problem. Every day there is a night. And then there is another use, which is relevant, because it impacts our life, which is to use light as in a sort of a decorative way, or to create an ambience, to create a feeling, okay? For that purpose, using light to paint the building, sometimes light designers will say this, which I can understand in their area. is fine, but for us it's chilling, like you're painting with the electricity, so it's very stressful. This is a good example of both. So here you have painting with light, so the building seems to float. This is in Castelo de São Jorge, a building designed by a fantastic architect. That is my father. It was kind of, I'm very impartial. No, it's actually very good, in my opinion. So you have here artificial light to create the feeling that the building is somewhat floating. But then you have very, very good daylight use, where inside these spaces you have the little bamboos, and then you have diffusive glazing creating a neutral, natural light that eliminates these archaeology specimens that we are trying to conserve. This is in Castelo de São Jorge. So when we start thinking about doing appropriate daylight, there is a very simple rule. So what's the link here? Of course, sustainable architecture and light. We need to do it well. Whenever the building is only one story, we should use skylights as much as possible and using diffuse glazing, because diffuse glazing creates a natural lamp effect. So the light doesn't go into the space as a sun patch, but works as a natural lamp that will be lit throughout the day. This is an example of a church where you have, again, diffuse daylight from the top, okay? And here you have a window that creates sort of a feeling of magnificence when you're looking at the priest and he's in against the light. So it creates like as if he comes from the sky in a way. Again, very good architect. Again, he happens to be my father. I'm sorry, I had all these photos and I was preparing this. I'm sorry. There are other great architects, I understand. He also designed this building, by the way. So anyway, this is a school. Again, we're doing an interesting, and of course, I showed you these examples because I also worked in them, so they are close to me. This is a school in Lisbon where, again, you're using diffuse light from the ceiling, okay, where we let the sunlight come in, and then you have these cloth cylinders that materialize the radiation and provide you with a natural light effect. It's quite sad that the architecture photographers always turn the artificial light on, you see there, to make it their photos. But in fact, you don't need it in these buildings. But they always do that as a reflex, okay? Another example, again, of a sort of ceiling-based light system. For a change, is a different architect, is Manuel Salgado. And this is a pavilion for the Oporto basketball team. This was in homage to my colleague that is from Oporto. I put the Oporto team here. And then we have the skylights pointing to the south with diffuse glazing. And what do we have? Inside, we have, again, a very distributed light. The heat stays in the top. Again, very sad that the photographer turned on the artificial light over there, okay? Now, you guys can say, this is great, but these are all skylights. Let's look at a normal building, much more difficult. I show you a normal building where I also worked a bit in the design. So this is a building in San Francisco. There is a federal building in downtown San Francisco that has two facades, northwest, this view, and this is northwest, and southeast here on the left, where on the southeast side there is a mesh, okay? Now, when we looked at the first figure I showed with the sun gains, we saw that the morning was worse, okay? And the east and the south are more punished. So this building, in fact, is quite difficult because it doesn't have internal shading, so you have direct sun coming into the workplace. And as you all may have experienced, direct sun and computers don't get along well at all. And in fact, we feel very warm. And then there's another problem. This building has natural ventilation, which was the aspect that I worked on, which is great, but it's very hard to combine natural ventilation with the shading, because the shading usually gets in the way of the air, so this is very difficult. So there's big challenges. These big challenges result sometimes in big disasters, like this one. where you have, this is in Japan, so there's not nearby. And in fact, he's a very good architect, considered very good. So this is the building. It looks very peculiar. And remember how the building was supposed to create conditions that were better, right? I told you in the beginning. So the people working there, they create little buildings inside the building to create conditions that are better than the ones that were created by the building. Because they are Japanese, they do this in a very orderly fashion. That's what I like. They look very peaceful, and right? If they were from another nationality, maybe they would have done something different. But this is an extreme example where you have lots of windows, lots of glazing. This will result in unfavorable working conditions and a lot of energy consumption. So in most of service buildings, office buildings, windows can be very tricky unless they are either on the roof, which can only happen on the top floor, or if they are facing north. Facing north is fantastic, but of course we have other orientations, so it's a very difficult topic. So to increase efficiency, the current recipe is to be careful with the windows and then use the best lighting technology, so use the best artificial lighting technology. The problem with the different technologies that we have for light is that none of them does a perfect job at reproducing the solar spectrum. This is how the colors are distributed along the visible solar spectrum, okay? And the problem we have is that different light technologies, fluorescent, incandescent, this one, of course, very, very inefficient, and LED, which is coming up quite strongly. The different technologies, none of them does a perfect job at having the same curve as the sun. And of course, we are adapted to this curve, or we were divinely created with this curve. And what that means is that when we are under fluorescent light, we don't like it very much. It's being replaced by LED, which is trying to improve, still some peaks there. This is a white LED, typical spectrum. And then there is incandescent, which was very effective, made it very hot in the summer. Sometimes in winter can be useful. But we liked it. It was a continuous spectrum with a higher level of what we call the warm light that is in fact associated to more energetic wavelengths. So the LED is the new technology that we all heard about. Maybe we all have it in our pocket, in the iPad, in the iPhone, or any other device not from Apple, which is not as good. We have LEDs, and they are under continuous development. There is a very interesting law, which is called the Heights Law, that we can trace a parallel between the Heights Law and Moore's Law for the chips, for the computer chip evolution. So it predicted quite early that LED capacity, so meaning how much light flux we could have in each LED, this is here, okay, and the cost will be going down significantly in every decade, okay, so an order of magnitude reduction per decade and a 30-fold increase per decade on the capacity of the LED. So LEDs would become more powerful and cheaper. That's what he's saying. And in fact, the data confirms the tendencies in this law. The cost is going down as predicted, and the flux is also following that prediction. What this means in practical terms is that we are seeing more and more sophisticated LED fixtures, here shown as a bulb. Of course, we have all other shapes, including here in our auditorium. But in the sense, it's important to look at it as a bulb because, of course, this bulb is trying to replace this bulb, and in fact is replacing this bulb that didn't do a very good job at replacing that bulb, right? So we had these bulbs, and we liked them, but they were very hot, and they failed, say, every 6 months. Then this compact fluorescent came in. We didn't like it very much because it took time to heat up, and it had all these issues. And now LED is coming. It's better, more expensive. It's still developing. But the important thing in the tiny numbers that I'm sorry that no one probably can read is that the efficiency between incandescent and LED, there is a factor of 10, okay? So the LED is 10 times more efficient. What does it mean? From each watt of electricity that is going to use, it will produce 10 times more photons that are visible. So the future in this sense is very bright. And if you combine this development with the renewable penetration and the improved PV technologies, we have an overall scenario that looks good and may help us get rid of many of the problems that we are creating right now that are being manifested in climate change and so on. LEDs are very compact, and they allow for lighting solutions in outdoor lighting that are new, where instead of us pointing lights at the building or the bridge or whatever, we can integrate the small light fixtures in the bridge, or in this case in the wheel. This is in London, as far as I recall. Another technology that's being introduced and should prove interesting is OLEDs. Some cell phones have OLED screens. They are stronger, they are brighter, and they can produce easily a distributed source like this. With these distributed sources, we can imagine, they're not real yet, large surfaces that can turn into light fixtures, being ceilings or even glazing. So there is an interesting future coming up in this area. We have here outside an interesting light solution also in the pavilion here, where there is a reflector behind these panels. It's outside our room, and there is light inside. So you have a sort of, this is a bit painting with light, but we tried to do it in the most efficient way. And it has also acoustic properties. So it's kind of a funny feature that we have next door of a somewhat efficient light solution that really brings us a different feeling. And that's also important. So thank you.
Time for questions now. Please.
Thank you for your nice talk. I have two questions, and I beg your pardon for the first one, because I am biology. I don't know what is OLED, and I would like to have, I need LED, but not OLED, this one. And the second is a question about the Pabellão de Conhecimento that everybody have seen. Is this was made now for the preparation of the museum, or was originally in the original building in the exhibition of '98? Perhaps the director could answer.
So OLED is organic LEDs, so it's just a different technology that allows for more compact bright sources and a sort of also an arrangement where instead of us having small fixtures, we can have light coming from surfaces. So that's quite interesting. And the way that's used in cell phones is you have cell phones whose screen is much brighter. Many Samsungs have that feature, and you can see a lot better outside with those. So regarding the pavilion I think is quite an interesting story, because it was originally sought out for a specific internal exhibit in the context of Expo 98 from 1998, and the subsequent use and reconversion for the Science Museum, with which Rosália Vargas and Marianne Gago were, of course, very involved, is, I think, a great success, because you come into the building and you ask that question, I think. Was this sought out to be like this? And that's quite good that we are able to have that doubt. And the last question, there were internal changes, among them this space that I showed in the last slide, that is from, I would say, 3 years ago, or maybe more, 4, 5, yeah, time flies.
I understand that you have been working in the project of the...
Yes, I worked in both the original project, I worked on it, it was my first ever work on building related things. at the time was my first, and then of course in the refurbishment I was involved in that.
For the people who don't know, Carrilho da Graça, the father, is one of the most famous Portuguese architects. And this is to say something, because Portugal is known for good architecture. We have 2 Pritzker prizes. Carrilho da Graça is not yet, but it may come. Pritzker is the equivalent of Nobel in architecture. Any further question? So maybe I ask something about the future of LEDs. Do you think that what are the predictions to have overall LEDs? I mean, for public illumination, is there a deadline, or is there some?
I think we are, well, what happened with LED was that initially it was very promising, and when I say initially, I'm talking about 10 years ago. So we all thought about it. It's going to be a big revolution. It's going to be, everything's going to be LED in, say, 2005 or whatever. It took longer. One of the reasons was, of course, cost. I showed cost as a problem. Initially it was very expensive. It still is somewhat. And the cost is going down very well. And then we had also problems with strength, where initially you didn't have enough concentration in small sources that allowed you to produce LED-based bulbs that could replace the existing bulbs. So that was a problem, where, of course, in anything related to buildings, it's very conservative, right? It's very slow, the transitions. I think LED finally is giving us better efficiencies than the fluorescent bulbs, which are quite efficient, in fact, although we don't like them so much. And it lasts longer. LEDs can last longer if they are properly cooled. So we also had some problems initially, say 5 years ago, where some designs didn't cool the LED properly, so it wouldn't last, say, 4 or 5 years that it's supposed to last, and it would last 4 or 5 months. So that also slowed down the penetration. But we're finally seeing it as a normal thing, where we say we're going to do a building just with LEDs, say a museum, and in some cases. But in most buildings we still see a lot of traditional light, although of course incandescent going down very fast.
Okay. So still a question?
My question is, I was thinking about OLEDs and surfaces. And can there be a hybrid surface that can use natural light but also have OLEDs in it, so the light source is the same, so you can control light by daytime and nighttime, something like this? There is some research in this aspect or something? Thank you.
Yes, I mean, my main area of expertise, just so we all are clear, is fluid mechanics and building natural ventilation. But I do consult in energy efficiency, so you don't get the wrong answer from me. But yes, there is research in precisely that double use of the surfaces, and that was the image I showed. Another interesting development that we are seeing now commercially in airplanes is also LCD-based shading. So where you have shading that is electrically controlled in a thin film in the window. And of course the importance of that is that if you have truly automated shading, the dangers of windows get lower, and we can have more windows that have embedded intelligence and can respond to the conditions, either closing down in terms of shading or opening up more to bring in more daylight, or during the night time becoming a fixture themselves. I think we'll see these things, but they're slow, but we'll see them.
Okay. Last one.
Small comment is that OLEDs particularly can be produced over flexible surfaces, plastic type. So you can make lights with any shape, which is an interesting thing, maybe. I'm not an architect, so I won't go into that point. But the question was another one. You mentioned costs for LEDs, normal lamps. Isn't it true or not that cost is largely dependent on the electronics which are required? so that you can plug a LED, which normally is a low voltage, high current device, on a normal plug, which you have 230 volts and a lower current. So you have to put a lot of electronics and put them in a small place and have to keep it cool and efficient. Isn't it the cost major factor there rather than the LEDs themselves?
I think you have both components in there, but I may be wrong. And I'm glad I said I was not the main expertise in LEDs. But I also, I'm sure you can recall that we have had for many years fixtures that require ballasts, transformers, and so on. So it's not as if it's a fully new requirement. But of course, cooling in the LEDs has been a major faux pas in the penetration of this technology.
Okay, so thank you. So let's move to the next speaker, who is going to be Adélio Mendes, a chemical engineer from the University of Oporto, and his talk is about the direct conversion of sunlight into useful energy, a whole new world.
Vai para duas coisas. Para ver o tempo. Deixa-me ver essa põe. Assim eu tenho controle de tudo. Okay. Eu sei que assim eu tenho controle. Boa tarde a todos. I'm going to speak in English because apparently there are people here that feel more comfortable with this. So, where is my presentation?
Is lost in the cloud.
Okay. Let's plug and then plug. Plug and plug. Deixa lá. Oh yeah.
That's there.
That's nice. Back to life. Ok. Então, se calhar ia falar em português, porque é mais fácil a comunicação, mais densa. Exato, é isso. Vou começar. Eu tinha um sonho. Daqui a 4 anos, cortar as minhas relações comerciais com os provedores de eletricidade. E em 2013 comecei a trabalhar nisso, no Douro. E é isso que eu quero partilhar hoje com vocês aqui. Acho que é um projeto bonito e que pode ter muitos atores. É nesse sentido que eu venho partilhar este sonho. Portugal é abençoado com muito sol. Só uma ideia, nós recebemos por metro quadrado por ano, no sul de Portugal, 2 megawatts-hora de energia. 2 megawatts. Hoje, ao meio-dia solar, devemos estar a receber cerca de 1 kilowatt-hora, peço desculpa, 1 kilowatt de energia por metro quadrado. Um aquecedor normal, elétrico, terá entre 1,5 e 2,5 kW, portanto, significam mais ou menos entre 1,5 e 2,5 metros quadrados de área iluminada por o sol do meio-dia. É fabuloso. Como aproveitar isto? A Comissão Europeia está-nos a ajudar nesse aspecto, porque vai pedir que a partir de do início de 2021 todos os edifícios sejam o que eles consideram Nearly Zero Energy Buildings. O que significa que a maior parte da energia, como estamos a ver, deverá ser produzida a partir de fontes renováveis, mas não só, deverá ser produzida próximo de onde é consumido. E isto é por lei. E, portanto, isto pode dar origem a muitas empresas nacionais a exportarem para o mundo inteiro. Portanto, isto é uma ótima oportunidade, como eu digo aqui. E a oportunidade lê-se desta forma. O custo de produção do fotovoltaico em Portugal é cerca entre 10 e 12 cêntimos por quilowatt. 10 a 12 cêntimos. Nós pagamos à volta de 20, 21, 22 cêntimos por quilowatt. Diferença brutal. O problema é simples, não é? Isto são dados da Comissão Europeia de 2013. Portanto, põe Portugal como um país muito interessante. Mas então eu ponho os painéis fotovoltaicos na minha casa, todo contente, e depois à noite ligo a televisão. Já não estou ligado à ADP e tal, ligo a televisão e não há eletricidade na rede interna porque não há sol, que chatice. Então eu tenho de armazenar esta energia para depois poder usar quando eu quiser. É o que se chama ser a energia despachável. Não é? O fotovoltaico não é muito despachável porque ele é produzido durante o dia, mas utilizado durante o dia e durante a noite. E o problema, eu posso dizer assim, está bem, mas eu vendo à EDP a eletricidade. A EDP remunera-me 5 cêntimos por quilowatt. Ora, eu paguei 10, 12 cêntimos e estou a receber 5, enfim, máximo 6 cêntimos por quilowatt-hora. Não é preciso ser muito inteligente para percebermos que estou aqui a ter prejuízo. Então, nós vamos precisar, de facto, de armazenar eletricidade e armazená-la localmente. E armazenar para estabilizar a rede, porque se nós começarmos todos a ir buscar à rede eletricidade e a injetar na rede eletricidade, a partir de um momento a rede deixa de ser possível de usar, porque começa a estar instável. Nós precisamos de armazenamento para tornar a energia despachável e nós precisamos de armazenamento para nos tornarmos independentes das empresas que fornecem de forma centralizada esta eletricidade. Há vários processos e tecnologias para armazenar eletricidade. Eu venho-vos falar de uma que eu penso que é mais promissora atualmente para armazenamento de energia estacionária. Não estamos a falar de automóveis, não estamos a falar de telemóveis, nem de computadores. Estamos a falar, então, das chamadas Redox Flow Batteries, ou em português, baterias redox de caudal. Há muitas pessoas que dizem que é de fluxo, mas não é de fluxo, é mesmo caudal, porque flow traduz como caudal, flux é que se traduz como fluxo. Como é que elas funcionam? Funciona de uma forma muito simples, é como uma célula de combustível, em que o combustível aqui é líquido. Nós temos as nossas espécies químicas redox em solução, de onde temos uma baixa densidade de energia, e esse é um dos problemas desta tecnologia, em solução, e vamos supor que de um dos lados nós originamos, durante o carregamento da bateria, a oxidação e no outro a redução. E a reação espontânea é a reação inversa. E quando ela ocorre, dá-se a regeneração, digamos, da energia elétrica que foi acumulada. E este sistema é bastante eficiente. Tem eficiências que podem ir até 99%. Eficiências de armazenamento de ciclo. Nós temos um líquido, temos aqui uma bomba, temos aqui 2 tanques e temos, de facto, as duas espécies redox, num e no outro lado, de uma célula, que é dividida por uma membrana que vai separar, é o eletrólito, enfim, que separa as duas espécies químicas, normalmente uma membrana que permuta ou cationões ou aniões, e vamos ver que no caso mais habitual desta tecnologia, que é usar vanádio, nós vamos ter que esta membrana vai ter que ser permeável só aos prótons. Não aos eletrões, mas apenas aos prótons. Portanto, é uma membrana de troca protónica. E cá temos nós as duas reações, com os potenciais aqui standard mencionados. A diferença de potencial desta reação é de 1,25 volts. Como ela não ocorre espontaneamente durante o carregamento, menos 1,25 volts. Durante a descarga, rigorosamente o contrário. E esta tecnologia tem números muito bonitos. Em termos de densidade de armazenamento, tem uma capacidade de cerca de 500 vezes menos de armazenar energia do que a gasolina e cerca de 20 vezes menos do que as baterias de lítio. Portanto, é mesmo para aplicações estacionárias. Tem uma eficiência de ciclo de armazenamento bastante razoável, cerca de 80%, mas um tempo de duração de 20 anos, sem problemas de descarregar completamente a bateria, de fazer curtos-circuitos, bastante estável. Tem uma voltagem nominal, como se disse, de 1,25 volts e o mais importante de tudo é que o armazenamento, espera-se que, enfim, com o amadurecimento da tecnologia, atinja os 3 cêntimos por quilowatt-hora. O que significa o seguinte: se aos 10 cêntimos, 12 cêntimos que me custa a produção elétrica fotovoltaica, se eu acrescentar o custo do armazenamento, eu fico com, enfim, vamos dizer, 15 cêntimos por quilowatt-hora. Fica bem abaixo do que nós, neste momento, pagamos à rede elétrica. E, portanto, é uma solução interessante. Há duas empresas na Europa significativas, uma delas é esta, é a Giltermeister, é alemã, que desenvolveu uma tecnologia que eles chamam CellCube. Este senhor é um amigo meu, tem mais 4 centímetros do que eu, e é uma bateria de 200 kW de potência. O armazenamento depende do volume dos depósitos dos eletrólitos. Neste caso deve ser de 400 kWh. Temos aqui uma bateria para campos fotovoltaicos, 6 metros, quase 6 metros, 2,5 metros. Portanto, estamos a falar de coisas realmente grandes. Existem outros desenvolvimentos que estão a ser feitos nesta tecnologia. Este é do ano passado, publicado na revista Nature, em que fala em densidades de corrente de 1,3 amperes por centímetro quadrado, já equivalente às células de combustível. O vanádio convencional, nós estamos a falar, efetivamente, de 100 miliamperes por centímetro quadrado, ou seja, 10 vezes menos que isto. Mas começamos a ver uma evolução muito rápida desta tecnologia para onde interessa. Temos aqui, o autor diz que potencialmente custa 70% menos do que o vanádio. Enfim, ainda estará por provar, mas provavelmente custará menos. E estamos a usar uma molécula orgânica, que é uma antriquinona, bastante estável, mas mesmo sendo bastante estável, provavelmente vai ter que ser mudada de vez em quando durante o tempo de vida útil dos 20 anos, não é? Do outro lado temos bromo. Temos aqui as reações, as duas reações, portanto, a da antriquinona e depois a do bromo. Este ano já foi publicado um artigo em que menciona 1715, creio eu, compostos orgânicos com potencial uso para baterias redox de caudal, com uma distribuição em termos de potencial de oxidação-redução bastante alargada. Então, só para dizer que as coisas estão em movimento. Em 2013 eu pensei sobre isto e perguntei, não é possível fazer mais do que o que está a ser feito agora só com as baterias? Porque, vamos pensar bem, Eu preciso transformar energia solar através de uma bateria em energia elétrica, e a energia elétrica tenho de armazenar nas baterias. Não seria possível eu armazenar diretamente a energia solar sob a forma eletroquímica? Não seria possível eu diretamente recolher a energia solar e armazená-la num sistema como este, uma Redox Flow Battery? Foi essa a questão. E a resposta é positiva. Portanto, durante muitos anos tem-se vindo a fazer investigação sobre células fotoeletroquímicas para fazer o que se chama a clivagem da água, ou seja, a produção de hidrogênio a partir da hidrólise da água. É uma reação bastante difícil de conseguir através do uso de um semicondutor que vai absorver a luz, e o semicondutor, ao absorver a luz, enfim, o que vai acontecer é que um eletrão que está na última camada dos átomos que constituem esse material é injetado, isto de forma muito simples, para uma outra orbital. Nós estamos numa banda de valência, passamos para uma banda de condução, dá-se a separação de cargas. Ou seja, nós temos, numa das bandas, temos falta de eletrões, na outra temos um eletrão excitado. E isto cria uma diferença de potencial. E esta diferença de potencial pode ser usada, potencialmente poderia ser usada para fazer a eletrólise da água. Infelizmente, todos os semicondutores que existem, os níveis de energia ou não se encaixam, digamos, nos níveis necessários para fazer a eletrólise da água, ou então corroem, o que é uma chatice. O único que se provou ser capaz de conseguir fazer a eletrólise da água, peço desculpa, foi o dióxido de titânio. Só que o dióxido de titânio é capaz de apenas absorver cerca de 5% do espectro solar. E, portanto, também não interessa, mas é de facto estável, enfim, faz tudo o que nós queremos. Ora, se nós tivermos um sistema como uma bateria redox de caudal, nós podemos escolher as espécies redox que queremos usar e, portanto, escolhê-las de forma a que se ajustem ao semicondutor de eleição que nós temos. Poderia ser, por exemplo, a hematita. A hematita é óxido de ferro, que tem um aspecto de absorção solar fabuloso, que é muito barato, muito eficiente, e nós conseguimos, de facto, potencialmente, podemos conseguir espécies redox que se ajustem a este semicondutor. E, portanto, a partir daí começou um grande esforço, uma campanha de investigação. Portanto, a ideia é nós termos aqui o semicondutor, que vai absorver a luz solar e vai, efetivamente, originar o carregamento da bateria. Portanto, o conceito, que não deve estar a mais de 4 anos de distância de estar cá fora, é que nós temos aqui o nosso painel que vai absorver a luz e vai transformar essa luz que é absorvida em energia armazenada de forma no sistema eletroquímico, mas ao mesmo tempo vai aquecer o eletrólito. E eu agora vou ter aqui uma grande quantidade de eletrólito que está a ser aquecido. E esse eletrólito aquecido eu posso usar para obter conforto térmico, aquecimento e arrefecimento da casa, aquecimento das águas sanitárias, mas também posso usar como bomba de calor para muitas outras aplicações, nomeadamente, por exemplo, para alimentar a minha máquina de lavar roupa ou louça. E em vez de eu aquecer através de energia elétrica, em que eu converto potencialmente sol em eletricidade a 10% de eficiência, depois eletricidade em calor 90 e não sei quantos por cento de eficiência, mas por caminho ainda há o transporte e, portanto, eu estarei a falar de uma eficiência global talvez de 7, 8%. Ora, os sistemas que captam a energia térmica são sistemas que normalmente têm eficiências de 70%. Ou seja, eu sou capaz de pegar num sistema e multiplicar-lhe a eficiência 10 vezes de forma muito simples. E, portanto, tenho aqui uma cogeração. Cogeração significa que eu estou a gerar dois tipos diferentes de energia. Energia eletroquímica, por um lado, que eu armazeno, e energia térmica, por outro, também é armazenável, mas que eu de facto quero usar para outras aplicações. Até este é o conceito. Eu depois pus aqui uns números. O consumo médio de uma casa na União Europeia é cerca de 9 kWh por dia. Se essa casa estiver em Portugal, vai precisar, em média, de 20 metros quadrados de área para captar a energia solar, para me produzir toda a eletricidade que eu preciso para a casa, usando apenas este sistema, portanto, em que eu carrego a bateria e depois uso a bateria para alimentar a minha casa, e assumindo a eficiência de 70% para o aquecimento da água, eu consigo aquecer quase 1000 litros de água dos 5 aos 60 graus Celsius. E nós começamos então a fazer experiências. Aqui as células, célula fotoeletroquímica laboratorial, de facto, para fazer os ensaios. Nós selecionamos este semicondutor. Há vários semicondutores que estão a ser usados. Eu aqui mostro este. É o sulfureto de cádmio. O sulfureto de cádmio tem o nível, a banda de valência, de valência está aqui, de condução está aqui, e os níveis necessários para a minha espécie química, oxidação, redução, estão bem dentro destes níveis. E, portanto, em princípio, é um semicondutor que permite fazer o carregamento da bateria. Está aqui o semicondutor. Eu vou avançar um bocadinho mais. Nós fomos trabalhando e desenvolvemos um semicondutor recoberto, portanto, de sulfureto de cádmio, recoberto a sedeneto de cádmio, em que tem uma corrente de 1,4 mA por centímetro quadrado, uma eficiência ao fim de 5 minutos de 86%. Portanto, está a sofrer, apesar de tudo, corrosão. Eu peço desculpa, mas vê-se muito mal os slides. E eu não sei porquê. Mas, enfim, falando um bocadinho sobre ainda este sistema. É um sistema bastante interessante, mas só permite carregar baterias de 0,6 volts, no caso do vanádio. E nós queríamos de 1,25 volts, o sistema normal de vanádio. O que nós fizemos depois foi associar a este fotoelétrodo de cádmio, nós associamos uma célula fotovoltaica, tecnologia, célula sensibilizada com corrente, as chamadas Dye Sensitized Solar Cells, de que temos aqui exemplo. Portanto, o que nós fizemos foi colocar aqui uma célula fotovoltaica semi-transparente, aqui um semicondutor e aqui temos a nossa bateria. Conseguimos, com isto, de facto, carregar uma bateria de vanádio a 1,25 volts de forma eficiente. Entretanto, nós já temos mais resultados em laboratório e estamos convencidos que no fim deste ano vamos ser capazes de propor uma nova tecnologia revolucionária outra vez para carregamento de baterias diretamente a partir da luz solar. O que é que isto quer dizer? Quer dizer que se as coisas correrem bem, daqui a 4 anos, nós não precisamos sequer ter painéis fotovoltaicos nas casas. Basta só ter painéis que vão converter a luz solar em térmica e em eletroquímica, e como é convertida em eletroquímica, é diretamente armazenável. E, portanto, eu espero, daqui a 4 anos, poder dizer que já não vou precisar mais de me ligar à rede elétrica, nem nacional, nem não nacional, porque torno autossuficiente. E isto é só meia verdade, porque se eu apostar depois na mobilidade elétrica, o consumo elétrico para a mobilidade é muito superior, em média, ao consumo de uma casa, o que vai exigir depois outras medidas. Mas, para já, é possível, de facto, é potencialmente possível daqui a 4 anos esquecermos a conta da eletricidade. Claro que o Governo depois vai dizer, pois, mas manter a rede elétrica nas cidades fica muito caro e, portanto, vão ter que pagar um imposto. E termino assim a minha apresentação.
So, any questions? Portuguese, English, Spanish? Please.
Bom, vejo então que já desenvolveu um pacote completo, porque aqui há uns anos foram as células fotovoltaicas baseadas em coranto, não é? Se eu estou a entender bem?
Sim,
Teve
sim.
uma patente sobre isso.
Várias, sim, é verdade.
Várias. Pronto, o professor não disse isso, mas ele teve uma patente de uns milhõezinhos aqui há uns anos. Agora está a caminho, pelos vistos, de outra. E fica o sistema completo, a célula fotovoltaica, a bateria para carregar e, quem sabe, qualquer dia deixa de ter a célula fotovoltaica. Explique-nos melhor isso, porque tem só um painel de que é o painel?
Eu não posso entrar em muitos detalhes, de facto. Mas o projeto, o fotovoltaico vai continuar lá. Agora
é o kit completo.
É
o
kit
kit completo. Já
nós
tratou
descobrimos
arrecadou a patente e agora está a preparar a outra. Está bem.
Nós descobrimos uma forma de carregar. Estamos agora, de facto, a fazer a experimentação, registrar a patente e implementar a tecnologia. Nós acreditamos que no fim do ano já teremos a tecnologia cá fora.
Outras questões?
Obrigado pela sua apresentação fantástica. A minha questão é a seguinte. Vem na sequência do que perguntou a professora Ana, mas o que é que falta fazer então nestes 4 anos para termos de facto o sistema operacional, não é? Mas uma segunda questão. Se podemos ter as casas daqui a 4 anos, casas, as superfícies, os telhados, portanto, a serem absortores de energia e converterem nessas diferentes formas e, portanto, não ser necessário o próprio painel, é isso? Ou termos o próprio telhado, e eu penso que há tecnologias para isso, ou havia, não baseadas neste sistema, mas em sistemas anteriores, os próprios telhados serem superfícies que faziam essa função, ou a própria telha, digamos. Não sei, em que pé é que está isso?
É assim, obviamente que esta tecnologia, se tivermos aqui a circular eletrólito, é muito feia e os arquitetos não nos vão deixar pôr nas superfícies, nas fachadas. A vantagem e a beleza desta solução tecnológica é que eu nas fachadas posso pôr células fotovoltaicas deste género, que todos vão gostar, que é o que eu estou... coisas assim deste género. E no telhado posso ter, digamos, o sistema eletroquímico. O sistema fotovoltaico pode estar ligado à bateria e está a carregar a bateria. Mas se eu tiver também uma turbina eólica, eu posso ligar à bateria e carrega a bateria. E se tiver aqueles painéis que eu mostrei com as células com o sistema fotoeletroquímico, também posso. É uma questão de custos. Mas, obviamente, que como nenhum arquiteto nos vai deixar pôr células fotoeletroquímicas nas fachadas, deixou de ser uma questão de custo para ser uma questão estética. E aí nós temos de pagar um bocadinho mais. A beleza é que nós podemos integrar tudo isto, sem problemas nenhuns.
Sim, claro. Obrigado.
Portanto, para quando? O que é que falta fazer? Deixem-me dizer mais uma coisa. Neste momento estão-se a fazer experiências e já temos alguns resultados preliminares em que pusemos micro-organismos a carregar estas baterias. O que é que falta fazer mais? Novos eletrólitos, bastante estáveis, mais adaptados. Algum estudo nessa área também é importante.
Okay. Well, I'll ask you in English because
sure.
I apologize for not speaking Portuguese, but I would like that you answer me in Portuguese. I like this language. Okay, please answer. Okay, the question is not toxic, etc., but somehow it will be destroyed after the use for a few years. What is destination? Because the prevision of a preview of destroying, accumulating, etc., all this material. I mean, when
I'm sure I understand.
Recycling is this. When you abandon, you destroy this house. What is the destiny of this, these materials?
So the life cycle assessment problem. This is, starting now. We cannot have the whole picture now about the life cycle assessment of this system. But what I can tell you is, if we use anthraquinones, they are produced by plants. So I think you can them because it's good for growing other plants. But you may mention as well, for instance, the proton exchange membrane we use inside. Yeah, they are probably the most efficient ones, but we are considering to use nanofiltration membranes because they are as good. And they have the problems of, say, Nafion, which is expensive and, yes, cause problem on dumping them at the end of lifetime. So what I can say is promising. This is a very benign technology, so a very green technology. In principle, it should not be have big problems. I report here the results of cadmium just because they were the first results that we obtained, because we are working with hematite now. It's our aim is using hematite. Hematite is harmless. It's nothing. And the thickness of the film is 15 nanometers. The rest is glass. That is amazing technology. I think very, very soon we are publishing the first articles now. They should be out before the end of the year. We believe that this will, from now on, a new research area will start. Because this is amazing. Instead of using water splitting, which is what everyone is now doing research and is quite complex, people will move soon, I trust on that, to redox flow batteries, because it's much easier and the potential is very, very high.
So it's a brand new world which is coming. So let's thank Adélio Mendes again and all the other speakers, and let's give the floor to Carlos Salema. It's my pleasure to do that, who is going to share the session about telecommunications, so for not only ELF, satellites, bridge telecommunications, optoelectronics is there for you. So thank you.